Alright, so this is just We the People news. Okay, I'm gonna make this quick and fast. Alright, so this video is actually by Fully Informed Jury Association. Okay, look them up, give them some love and all that kind of stuff. I haven't did it on the last couple of videos. However, you know, they really contest a lot of studying about jury notification, this and that. Alright, so look her up. She really is informed about jury notification.
Situation with grand juries. The standard stereotype is that except in cases of police or government officials, grand juries can indict a ham sandwich. And what a lot of us have wondered, I think, is I'm told I'm loud and you're fairly quiet. So how about I back up and you...
We talked about this before. The reason why they can indict a ham sandwich is because the prosecutor is allowed to lie to the grand jury, people. They're liars to try to get that conviction or to proceed forward in the case. Okay? On top of, you don't have an attorney in there protecting you, or you are not allowed to be in there to argue the case. This is all one-sided, the grand jury is. And they're legal to lie to the grand jury. And the grand jury says, oh, okay, well, there's enough evidence here because the prosecutor lied.
Screw shop. and I'll try and moderate my volume here a little bit.
Yeah, in terms of grand juries, I think what we have to think about is what the intention was and where we are. And so all of this conversation, I want everyone to be clear that, the jury, just like other parts of government, there can be reform. And, if we reinvigorate the jury, reform can be part of that. But originally, when we're thinking about the grand jury, you needed 12 people on a grand jury to say yes to someone having that case go forward. And then you needed 12 people on a jury to convict that person. And so you had 24 people standing in the way of someone being convicted of a crime.
The grand jury is actually what they're saying is that there is enough probable cause to proceed forward. That is what the whole ordeal is about the grand jury. In fact, a lot of times, we talked about due process, right? I have a right to due process. So why do we not have a grand jury to find out there's probable cause to go ahead and proceed forward? Well, because they listen to liars and they go ahead and proceed forward like if they, what they said, a sandwich. They indict a sandwich.
Fine. And now we have one person, and we can talk about this more, but sometimes it's a police officer because they don't do a lot of investigation at the prosecutor level, especially in states, or it's the prosecutor. And so instead, essentially, of 24 people standing in the way of someone going to prison, we have one person standing in the way of someone going to prison. So even if, let's say, the grand jury isn't the significant stop place, it can be a stop place. And so, for example, if anyone wants to look up, in 2013, there's an example that you can see on the web that's described of a person, a teenager who posted something on Facebook that was a rap, that involved saying, words like the White House, saying some other words. And he was prosecuted in Massachusetts. And he could have received 20 years in prison from what I've read about this. And this case went to a grand jury, and the grand jury said no. And, so grand juries sometimes will stand in the way. And then I will also say, with respect to grand juries which sometimes will just sort of say no in some police cases, I don't think that's probably the problem of the grand jury. It might be the problem of what evidence is presented by the prosecution in some of those cases. And I encourage some of you to take a...
And I'm a firm believer of the grand jury needs to know more about the Constitution than even the regular juries do. But I think both of them needs to absolutely know the Constitution. Period. Y'all. So that way they can actually say, hey, this code is violation of the Constitution.
Look at the Ferguson case. I saw a really interesting presentation by our law students at the University of Illinois of that grand jury proceeding, because it's available, and they acted it out and used the actual transcript. So you have to kind of like look under the hood to see what's going on. And so again, reform's possible and absolutely necessary in the jury system, but it is a fantastic system if we use it in the right way.
Yeah, speaking of the Ferguson case, that also brings to mind the grand jury that was supposedly convened to investigate the killing of Breonna Taylor. And it came out that the prosecution had publicly misled us to believe that they had put all kinds of effort into it and were really trying to indict. And then when that happened, some of the, I believe 3 of the grand jurors went to an attorney and filed to get permission to speak publicly about what really happened, which surprisingly they got. And when that happened, it came out that they weren't offered nearly the level of charges that they had been expected, or that they had expected to be offered, and which we, the public, were led to believe they had been offered and rejected. Do you have any thoughts on how grand jurors can push back in these sorts of situations, or anything that can be done?
Again, what did I say? Prosecutors are allowed to lie.
Done outside of the grand jurors themselves to help. It's kind of a tough situation because grand jury secrecy, there is a reason for that, but it's kind of got the two sides. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
And I think it's
see, up to 50 years ago, how did we get a grand jury without lawyers before we had lawyers, y'all? We the people. We the people. We went to them and told them that this case needs to be looked up at. The grand jury is supposed to be open to we the people. It's not supposed to be this big secret thing. Now, they can do this argument, this, and this, right? High crimes and this, that, here, and there. However, if I got a case, I had to take it to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor's got to take it to the grand jury? No. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Just saying.
Thanks for mentioning that example, and that's a great current example. I think I right now I don't have any sort of cures for this system. I think that it's pretty basic to me in the way that if a prosecution wants to go forward with a case, it has to present the best case that it has, and in cases where there isn't a good case, it is upon the prosecution to do some investigation and to do the right thing and not prosecute those cases. And I think that a lot of that work at this point needs to be done by prosecutors. I think the grand jurors in the situation where Breonna Taylor was killed, I think that they obviously, I think, did a great job in doing what they could do to come forward through a lawyer, and so I think in this world of media and social media, there are more opportunities for people to step up, but right now I think we need all of this reinvigorated, and then we can think about much more in terms of reform.
Yeah. Another thing that seems to have been flipped around, and I'm going to try and tie this back to the grand jury as well, is it used to be that people were fully informed and knowledgeable about jurors' right to judge the laws as well as the facts in the case. And you talk about in the book, for example, the case of John Peter Zenger, who seemed very well protected by conscientious jurors, not only trial jurors, but also grand jurors. Can you briefly summarize that case for us, for those who are not familiar with it yet? And then compare Zinger's jurors and their knowledge about jury nullification to maybe more typical jurors today.
Sure. Yeah. So in this case, you had this newspaper publisher, journalist who published this newspaper, sort of voicing disagreement with the royal governor, and so he was charged with libel. And the law at that point was different than the law is now, and so what he had done essentially was illegal, and so he was attempted to be indicted by a grand jury, and the grand jury said no. And then they put it towards another grand jury, and the grand jury said no. And then they sort of usurped the grand jury and went to trial, and the jury said no. And so this is a great example of the power of the jury to say, even if there is a law and it's been violated, we as a community get to decide whether or not that is a good thing. And more recently, in talking about my documentary with various folks, I heard about a couple of cases in the South recently where people were prosecuted for drug crimes, and juries have said no and have invoked nullification. And of course, Kirsten, you know of many more of those circumstances, and I know that's your organization is very much wants to inform jurors of that. So now there isn't the court hasn't courts aren't allowing jurors to know about this right by an affirmative sort of instruction, telling them about this right. And so it takes away the power of jurors when they're actually told, you need to follow the law, this is the law, you need to follow this law, when really in the scheme of things and given history they don't. That is part and parcel of our history and of the right to a jury trial that's in our Constitution.
Yeah, I have one eyeball over on the Facebook comments, and Bob Smiley reminds me that we actually have Eric Haley, who has done a lot of volunteer work for FIJA, who actually received jury nullification information from Bob and then proceeded to get called on a grand jury and utilize that information. So I'm glad you were talking about this, because I'd forgotten about that. And we also have talked about a grand jury in Tucson that was doing exactly what you said. They became known as the notorious 269th because several of the grand jurors started refusing to rubber stamp indictments for felony drug crimes for like minor possession and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely a realistic thing that can be done even now, despite people not necessarily knowing about it. Now, you talked a little bit earlier about a night.
All right, we're going to pause right there because that was a good one to end off at. We need to realize our rights even as jurors, people, and jury notification, right? In essence, juries are judges, and you are allowed to judge the law. Is it constitutional? Do you want that law to apply to your kids or to you or your husband and wife? Sit and think about that, y'all. If you're going to get 5 years to the pen for an ounce of marijuana, should that be legal? And who's the victim? Just saying. At least read People News.